Good afternoon. We're at time, so I think we'll begin. Welcome to our session on reaching lower income consumers with nutritious foods, strategies, evidence, and innovations. My name is Saul Morris. I'm Director of Program Services at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Really thrilled that you are still with us at the end of a long day, and I think you'll be pleased that you came to this session because we have a very distinguished panel who are going to share some really interesting set of insights. We're going to be starting from my organization also. Stella Nordhagen will be the first speaker. Our second speaker joins us from Bopink, Nick van der Velde. Our third speaker will be Panjani Nkambula, who's also from the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. And finally, we have somebody who will join us online. That's Lucy Klaasveld-McGrath, who works for Hystra Strategy Consultants based in Paris. So I'm not going to take up any more of your time. I think you all understand that food is bought and transacted in the private sector. It's companies that do that. And of course, there's always a concern with all market-based operations that we want to be sure that they truly are reaching the poorest. And there's a risk, of course, when things are based on financial transactions, that the poorest may be excluded from those transactions. And so looking closely at the mechanisms which might allow private sector companies to reach further down the socioeconomic ladder is really, really important. And we're going to start with a presentation that will enlighten us on just that, the systematic review of approaches for reaching lower income consumers with nutritious foods. Stella, over to you.
All right, thanks very much, Saul, and thanks everybody for joining. So indeed, I'll be talking some about a systematic review we did and some insights that came out of that. But before I do just want to motivate a little bit more about why we're in this session, why we care about this topic, why we thought it was worthwhile to look into it a bit more. As probably everybody at this conference already knows very well, the latest SOFI reports have said that over 3 billion people globally cannot afford a healthy diet. We also know that nearly everyone all over the world gets at least some of their food from the private sector, from private sector companies and private sector supply chains. And most people get nearly all of their food from the private sector. So when we look at these facts jointly, it becomes clear that there's probably some really important role for the private sector to play in increasing access to nutritious foods that make up a healthy diet. And that if we can unlock the ways for making that work, there's a huge potential that can be tapped in terms of bringing down that number of 3 billion people who can't afford a healthy diet. But that's not necessarily that easily done, because for businesses to serve lower income consumers, they need to find a viable business model. So they need to be able to somehow capture value for themselves, and through that turn a profit that will enable them to continue to function as private companies, while also meeting customer needs and doing that at a price that they're willing to pay, despite the fact that they're on a low income. And this gets more complicated because oftentimes lower income consumers, drivers of food choice, can be a bit different from those of higher income consumers. Obviously, lower income consumers is a hugely diverse group, a large share of the population. It's difficult to make any broad generalizations about them. But when we look at the literature on this, we do see that there are some ways in which they tend to be similar. Most obvious, they face absolute limits on what they can spend on food. They just don't have as much money, they can't spend as much. But in addition to that question of the level of income, there's also the question of the variability of income. Oftentimes, lower income consumers have higher levels of income variability. Oftentimes, their incomes can be relatively unpredictable, and they tend to be more exposed to shocks to income, which can disrupt their income. Lower income consumers often tend to place more weight on something being high value for their money. So is it something that's satiating? Will it last a long time? Does it take a lot of additional ingredients to prepare? They're often risk averse because they have little margin for waste. If their family doesn't like something and they have to throw it out, that's a really significant loss in a way that it might not be for higher income consumers. Lower income consumers oftentimes will prioritize retail outlets that offer informal credit or the ability to bargain. They may face time poverty, which causes them to place additional weight on the convenience of foods. Sometimes they may have lower literacy, so they might not be as ready to understand labeling and marketing, and they might also have limited media access. And then finally, some lower income consumers lack storage or refrigeration space that makes it difficult to engage in advance or bulk purchases. So these are things that companies need to take into account when they're trying to reach these types of consumers. But layered onto that is the additional challenge of nutritious foods. And nutritious foods, as many of us are well aware, come with some special challenges. On the demand side, there's often low demand for nutritious food, and an individual company that wants to invest in creating that demand may find that it's not viable for them because it's a public good that also accrues to other companies that are working in the same space and has limited return that can result in higher profits for them. The nutritional value of products is often invisible. It's what we call in economics a credence good, so you have to believe it. In order to buy it, you don't necessarily see the benefits clearly. That means that it's often hard for firms to charge a premium for nutritious products, and there's a risk of being undercut by other firms in the same market who are putting something forward as equally nutritious. Maybe it's not actually as good, but it's kind of impossible for the customer to tell just by looking at it. And that is compounded by the fact that in many low and middle income countries, there's limited labeling or capacity for actually enforcing that labeling. So those are all demand side challenges. On the supply side, there's also many challenges. In general, the agriculture and food sector is challenged by having very thin profit margins, a high degree of seasonality, higher than average levels of risk, and also the ease of copying products. It's very easy to see a rival, a competitor, and copy their product relatively quickly. And in addition, perishable products, which of course are many of the highly nutritious foods that we really care about, like fresh fruits and vegetables, dairy products, meat, have to contend with issues all along the supply chain of poor infrastructure that can increase the rates of loss and spoilage and again cut into profits. So all those challenges, meeting customer needs, trying to balance that against the challenges that are inherent in nutritious foods, what can companies do? Well, that was what we set out to answer in our systematic review. We wanted to identify promising approaches to adapting business models that can be used to reach lower income consumers with nutritious foods. And I'm not going to go into any detail on the methods. If you'd like more about that, please feel free to scan the QR code, which will take you to the published paper about this, and you can find all the methods as well as results in there. But in short, we did a systematic review of research literature and gray literature, as well as a review of actual companies out there in the real world and what they're doing. And through that, we got 74 documents from research reports eligible to include, as well as 99 potential firms that were eligible for inclusion. We looked across all those different experiences and evidence, and were able to synthesize 13 unique approaches to adapting business models, which are often used in combination and are always used as part of a broader business model that includes aspects related to marketing and appropriate internal financial controls and all those other things that a company needs to have in place. So what are they? So the first set that we identified, which was 5 approaches, is about adapting the product itself. So changing the product to make it more appealing, accessible to lower income consumers. One of the easiest ways to do this is to just replace certain ingredients with cheaper alternatives. So product was originally made with chicken, replace that with soy, cheaper product. Another related one is to repurpose food waste as ingredients or inputs into the production of food products. A nice example of this comes from the company Ray-Ban Pack in Ecuador. And what they do is they use whey, which is a waste product from cheese production that's normally just dumped into rivers in Ecuador at a large environmental cost, and they repurpose that to create a fortified yogurt. Whey is dense in protein, and because it's a waste product, it's available very, very cheaply, so you get a nutritious product, low price point. Another option is to not actually manipulate the price itself, but change the perceived value by making the product more convenient for the customer so that they're more willing to pay for that. A nice example of that comes from the social enterprise Nutritious in Madagascar. And what they do is they sell a ready-to-eat fortified blended porridge, and they sell it at what they call baby restaurants in low-income neighborhoods, as well as through door-to-door salespeople. And this porridge is ready to eat, so caregivers, they don't have to spend the time preparing porridge for their baby, they don't have to go to fetch water, they don't have to go to fetch fuel, and that convenience and time saving is worth money to them, so they're willing to pay for it and to purchase this product. Another option is to segment products by quality. So an example of this comes from Spar, a supermarket chain. In South Africa, what they do is they procure fresh produce in rural areas, and then they grade it. So they take the produce that is very high quality, meets their standards, and sell that to urban areas. And then they take the produce that maybe it's a little discolored, maybe it's a little misshapen, maybe it's a little too small, and they sell that back to the local community at a discount. A related way of doing that is to use the parts of a product that are usually less desired and to segment those out and sell them to lower income consumers. So this is done often, for example, with fish, to take the fillet of fish and sell that in an upper income urban market, and then take the organ meats, maybe the fish head, package that together and sell that to lower income consumers. The next set of approaches that we identified, which was 3 approaches, has to do with adapting the packaging that a product comes in. So one that I think we're probably all well aware of, that we've seen many times, is simply making the package smaller. So example of this comes from Nestle. Globally, they have a line of products that they call popular position products. These are small servings of food that are sold at a low price per package because it's a very small amount, so they can sell it at a low price. And this results in over 8% of their annual global sales as a few years ago. So this is not a small line of their business. Obviously, not everything that's being sold in that way is necessarily a nutritious food, but there are some that are, and it's a useful lesson that we can draw to apply to nutritious foods. 2 other ways to adapt packaging to increase accessibility for lower income consumers have to do with selling things in flexible quantities. So instead of making something only available in 1 kilogram or 1 liter, allow for flexibility in how much a customer can purchase to enable them to align that to the income that they have available. Or also to remove the packaging or to use reusable packaging, which can result in lower packaging costs. Packaging often being one of the more expensive cost items in low and middle income countries because it needs to be imported. So an example that combines both of these 2 approaches comes from several dairy producers in Kenya. And what they do is they have machines that they call milk ATMs. And these machines are exactly what they sound like. You're a consumer, you go up there with your own glass, your own container, you choose exactly how much or how little milk you want, you get it, and you can pay accordingly. So with as little as 5 cents, you suddenly have access to milk, whereas if you wanted to buy a whole liter, it would have cost a lot more. The third set of approaches have to do with distribution and retail and how one can adapt that approach to better reach lower income consumers. So one way to do that is to, instead of doing distribution separately to many different destinations, many different retailers, to centralize that. Set up a hub where you consolidate many different aspects of distribution at once, and as a result, cut the costs. An interesting example of this, also from Kenya, is a company known as Copia. And what they do is a kind of assisted e-commerce. So rural customers can go to a sales agent that's based in their village. They can order something through an online app, getting assistance there in case they're not used to using an online app to shop. And then instead of those products being shipped to those customers individually, as usually happens within e-commerce, they're aggregated over a period of time, they're grouped together, and they're all shipped to that same sales agent in that village at a much lower cost. And then local customers can go directly to them to pick up their products. Another option, which Lucy will speak about later, is creating a bespoke last-mile distribution network, so your own network just for your products to take them out to consumers. Another very simple option that I think we've all seen around is simply that you set up a shop in a low-income area, and you're right there, and you've cut out a lot of the distribution costs, so you can reach those consumers at a lower cost. And then the final example related to distribution and retail is to work through existing retail networks that are already out there, but to recognize that there might be ways in which they need additional support and to provide that. So a nice example of this comes from Alquería, which is a dairy company in Colombia. And what they do is in remote rural areas, they support retailers by targeting a local resident who lives nearby and deputizing them as a distributor for the company's products. They are given training, they can use their house as a warehouse, and they're given financing to purchase a small delivery vehicle. And then there's somebody who's locally in the community who's able to serve those retailers with distribution of the company's milk products. So final adaptation to business models that we uncovered in the review has to do with the overall company cost structure. And this is cross-subsidizing one type of product with another type of product, or cross-subsidizing sales to one group of consumers with sales to another group of consumers. An example of this comes from Nigeria, a company called Promise Point Limited. And what they do is they have a business line where they are processing cassava and coming up with high-quality food ingredients that are used by multinational companies in their products, and they sell that to those companies with like a nice comfortable margin, and they're then able to use some of those profits to subsidize a biofortified porridge flour that they sell to the local population. So leveraging the different willingnesses and abilities to pay of those different customer groups to result in improved price point for the lower income consumer group. So this is a research conference. I'm sure a lot of people in this room are wondering, okay, these are very nice stories and case studies, but what's the evidence? How do we know that these actually work? I'm running out of time, so I won't have too much time to get into this, but the good news is that there isn't that much to say because there's actually very little rigorous evidence that this works. In our review, we looked for evidence about reaching lower income consumers, about the firm's profitability, and about diet quality and whether they were actually improving the diets of the customers that they were reaching. And we found very little evidence, so only 9 to 15 out of 99 case study firms had any evidence on these topics. Essentially, none of them met our standards for high quality evidence. In terms of reaching lower income consumers, there was only one case study which was able to show reach to a high share of a lower income population. On profitability, only 3 had evidence that they were actually profitable in doing this. And in terms of diet quality, most reported simply the frequency of consumption without any evidence about how these products actually fit into a broader healthy diet. So there are a lot of research gaps to be filled in this space. And just to sum up, we did a systematic review that identified 13 business model adaptations that can be used to reach lower income consumers with nutritious foods. Most of these have been used for diverse foods in diverse regions and by both small and medium-sized enterprises as well as large multinational firms. At the same time, we found very little rigorous evidence of their effectiveness and identified an important gap for future research. At the same time, while there might not be that much research evidence on these topics, there is a lot of programmatic experience, things that have been tried in the real world with different companies, and that's revealed a lot of success stories and also a lot of challenges with making this work, which I think is what some of my fellow panelists are going to get into next. So thank you very much for your time. If you'd like to read the published paper, you can scan the QR code up here. And we also developed a set of succinct briefs that are more geared towards kind of a practitioner audience within this space that really distills down the findings into easy to read, bullet points, infographics, all of that. So hope you find some of that useful.
Thank you so much, Stella, for that rather sobering first introduction to this set of topics, realizing that the evidence base is rather sparse. Nonetheless, I think we all greatly appreciated this fantastic methodology where you bring together both the academic literature, the grey literature, and the company experience, and this very clear organization of the different strategies. I think that's tremendously useful to us all. Just before we go to the next session, I'd like to remind the users who, listeners who are joining us online that you can submit questions on the Q&A function in the app. So please, I don't see any just yet, but please feel free to do that as we go along. The rest of you who joined us in the hall at the end of all the speakers will invite questions on all of the different topics. So next, very pleased to introduce Nick van der Velde, who will be talking about competing in nutrition, boots on the ground, and state-of-the-art technology. Nick, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be here and talk indeed a bit more about reaching low-income consumers with nutritious foods. Yes, my title is Competing in Nutrition, Boots on the Ground, and State-of-the-Art Technology and Practices, and this session specifically looks at lessons learned and best practices from working with the private sector. So little evidence there, but I hope nevertheless it's interesting for you to listen to. So. BOP Inc. Stands for BOP Innovation Center, and what we've done over the last 15 years is to develop and test creative, novel and innovative ideas on how to make inclusive business work, specifically on reaching low-income consumers with private sector. And as Innovation Center, we're very keen to share these lessons and best practices. So if you go to our website, we have a lot of these cases, and we're happy to share more on that. And our expertise sort of cuts across these three domains. And first is on product and service design, so how to build, for instance, nutritious products or improve them. Second is on marketing and distribution, which is really about what we're talking about today as well. And the last one is on how to make that all work from a commercial standpoint and make a successful business model. Now, this one I'll skip. What I wanted to point out is that as BOP Inc. we work in multiple sectors. That's important because reaching low-income consumers is very important in many different sectors, and lessons learned from, for instance, the renewable energy sector or water, sanitation and hygiene or financial services are very important as well, I think, for the nutritional sector. What we do is we work a lot with both private and public organizations and try to sort of bridge the gap and making them work together or dance together, as we like to refer it ourselves. And that allowed us to really work with a very interesting set of organizations, which is also the best part of, I think, my job, is to work with such a variety of organizations. Let's say on the private sector side, we worked a lot with organizations such as DSM, Unilever, the larger ones, or Spar. Friesland Campina, but also with over hundreds of local SMEs as well, which again I'll share some lessons on. This is some of the countries we work in, so you know where our practices come from. Skip this as well. So I know you guys have already almost 3 days full of conference and a lot of ideas and heavy charts and whatnot, so I thought, can I give sort of 5 interesting thoughts for you to take home, and maybe a bonus thought even, and hopefully you have something to, let's say, take home. The first one is like, why is it so hard to reach BOP consumers? Well, the way we see it is that if you would, for instance, sell a nutritious product to a middle-income consumer in Kenya and Nairobi, it's fairly easy. You can just Google the supermarkets and pick up a phone and call these markets. But as soon as you try to reach the low-income consumer, perhaps in peri-urban or rural areas, it gets more and more hard. The shops, the points of purchase are hard to find. You realize that the distribution is non-organized or little organized. Very little organizations out there that you can collaborate with. So it gets harder and harder. At the same time, if you do manage to get all the way there, and you get to that point where the low-income consumer does make his or her purchase, you realize that there's heavy competition. Not competition perhaps between nutritious products, but competition for the $50 that they might have to spend. And that's what I was referring to in my title as well, is that ultimately you're competing as private sector company in this space. This is a photo of one of the programs we did in Pakistan. This is a fortified or a balanced energy protein product. But it was interesting that we managed to pilot various distribution channels, both in rural, peri-urban, and urban, and very interesting lessons there as well. Now you might say then, are there any businesses that actually do have an interest to step in this domain in terms of reaching low-income consumers? And the answer is yes. As Bopink, we work in numerous programs and, for instance, accelerators. And when we do invite companies to, for instance, submit a proposal or an idea, we get lots of applications, both from, again, multinationals, but also lots of local businesses. So, for instance, this is an example of one of the accelerators that we ran with the Sun Business Network. And we have done several ones with Gains as well. And they have an interest. Why? Because ultimately the potential, the business potential is very high. If you can make a nutritious product that fits well, is at affordable price point, it offers a good business opportunity for these businesses. Now, what then you need to do in order to reach them? Well, this is the interesting and complex part, and I'm very interested that also our next speakers will talk more about this. But yeah, you have to go where they buy their products, and that often is complex. You go from the capital to the province, from the province to the districts, you go deeper and deeper, and then you start to build your team. And the fact of the matter is, it becomes very quickly a very labor-intensive and hyper-local endeavor. You start working with people that know the districts, they know the town, the shops, and they start trying to figure out how these shops can basically sell and promote your products in the right way. But it's, as I said, it's a very labor-intensive, very capital-intensive endeavor, and not many companies manage to do it. This is a photo of a company in Ethiopia, Guts Agro. They were selling fortified corn-soy blend, and they built their own network of agents that were penetrating several towns commercially. Now, of course, I try to have something that people might say, ooh, well, I wanted to challenge you a little bit by saying what most public organizations underestimate, and that is, I think, the intensity and the complexity of these hyper-local distribution networks. And that makes it hard. Sometimes when we talk with donors or funders or other organizations, is that sort of slowly, when we talk about the details and the things and the bottlenecks that actually make it work to reach those consumers and reach scale, is that slowly the light goes out. And the downside of that is that I think a lot of programs and some funding mechanisms are not well suited to actually help these organizations to scale up and increase their reach. So that is a bit what I'm preaching here, is that it's very important to have enough support and funding available for these organizations in the last mile to establish that reach. On top of that, is that I think once we talk about reach, is that a lot of organizations also put a lot of different complex criteria and demands. They want to know exactly where products are sold. They want to know, preferably twice a month, where it's sold, how much is sold, when it's sold, if the customer fits the low-income definition. So while a company is working very hard to get the product in the right place, at the same time, there are a lot of demands to capture all these data. And it's not that these companies don't want it. On the contrary, they know that data is super important to drive the efficiency of their channel, to understand their customers, to understand their agents, potentially get investment. But it's just another layer of complexity that's pushed on top of this channel development. Now, what can we do in terms of reach? I think it's important that private and public sectors have a discussion and try to understand from each other sort of what the needs are in terms of building your last mile distribution network. We're also proud at Bopink to be one of the co-founders of the Global Distributors Collective. This is an association of distributors, which is purely about distribution, and it has a lot of best practices and lessons learned actually that are publicly available. And also this association, for instance, makes specific funding available purely on building and strengthening their networks to reach low-income consumers. As promised, I also have a bonus question, bonus thought. Let me put it that way. How to understand reach bottom up. I think what we enjoy sometimes doing as well with a lot of businesses is that we go quite rural, or we go pretty deep peri-urban and visit the low-income households. And we actually check in their shelves in the products they buy, and we ask them where they get it from. And very often, some of these places where they get their products from, even the companies don't know, they're not aware of. For instance, in Tuscale, we work with a poultry company in Mozambique. They thought they had a range of around 100 kilometers in terms of distribution reach, but they found their packaging and their boxes 800 kilometers up north, meaning that people were buying and reselling their frozen chicken all the way up to towns they didn't even imagine. So sometimes when a business does really well, some of the impact they actually create is, let's say, hard to measure. And that's sort of where I want to leave it for now. I do want to point out that on Friday we have another session as Bopink with our Tuscale program, where actually we invited a couple of businesses that are present here as well. And then we also talk more about evidence and proof on both the nutrition end as well as on the reach end. So I really invite you to also be present on Friday afternoon. And I'd like to hand it over to my next speaker.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. Some note of optimism there. Good to confirm that companies really are interested in making inroads into this enormous market. So in spite of the many challenges that we've heard about from both our first two speakers, there is real interest there, and you shared with us also that reach can be huge if you get it right. And so there's a big payoff if you can design your product and services in the right way to reach these audiences. Thank you. Now we will turn to Panjani, who will be talking about the specific case of fortified foods, some of the successes, challenges, and opportunities in helping that product to reach low-income consumers. Over to you.
Thanks, Saul. So what I'm going to try and do over the next 10 minutes or so is to build on both Stella's presentation and Nick's. I will particularly borrow on what Stella presented in terms of the various models that businesses use to reach low-income consumers, and kind of bring that back home to say, what does that mean in the context of a particular category of foods? And in this case, I'm talking about fortified foods. So it's not one type of fortified foods, but fortified foods more generally. And why fortified foods? We know, like Stella said, that 3 billion people in the world cannot afford a healthy diet. One way we try and get nutrients to people is by fortifying foods. But just because we say staple foods are generally affordable, it doesn't mean that everybody can afford them. So there's still people with lower disposable income. So even producers of fortified foods, have to come up with business models or ways and means to reach the poorest. But although I'm saying I'm borrowing from Stella, Stella did this fantastic systematic review, very laborious, intellectual heavy, which of course concluded that there isn't evidence of effectiveness. That's where the comparisons end. Mine is a combination of what Stella found out and from the University of Life experience in programming. So I make no claims to some fantastic research about this, but just borrowing what came out of this and say, how does this actually manifest in practice? So with that caveat, let's roll on. So just to remind everybody, when we talk about fortified foods, what's the current status globally? So we know there is 144 countries that mandate at least one food vehicle. So it could be salt, it could be edible oils, wheat flour, maize flour, edible oils, or whatever. At least 144 countries, one or more. And that represents 75% of all countries globally, and that's a huge number. The most successful or the most fortified food vehicle is salt. And if you look at UNICEF data, almost 90% of people globally consume salt that's fortified. Doesn't matter the level of fortification, whether it's great or not, but at least 90%. Yes, I know some of the data is around 10 years old, but that's the best we've got. Even if we can discount for that data, it's still the most fortified food vehicle. But the question becomes, what are some of the ways that these companies are using to reach out to the poorest or these low-income consumers? And this is where the similarities with what Stella was talking about, begin to kick in. So if you go to shops, you'll find sachets of fortified foods, whether this is edible oils or other products. So, small products that you could buy. If you look at salt, or take the case of bouillon cubes, which essentially is flavored salt, it could be packaged in packs of 50. But shopkeepers typically break them and sell in singles, in twos, in threes. And that's because they want to make it affordable to the consumers that are buying these products. And then there's, Stella mentioned about flexible packaging. This is a particular case where you go to a market, they sell by the cup, they sell by the spoon, or you bring in your own container and they decant the oil in it. So you've got 20 cents, you buy your fortified oil for 20 cents. So that's one of the ways the businesses are using to reach the low-income consumers. And there is significant savings. So I was in the market in Bangladesh, 6 months ago, and if you buy oil that is loose, you pay 30% cheaper than oil that is packaged in a bottle. And that's because the 30% accounts for the cost of the bottle. So there's real, significant differences in terms of savings to be made. But these companies also are following consumers where they are. So these small shops in neighborhoods where people with low incomes live. But there are also significant issues with some of these business models. So yes, they're reaching the poor, but what actually is happening on these markets? I took this picture in a market in Dhaka in Bangladesh. These are drums of edible oil that are available in the market. Consumers are buying oil from these drums. They bring their container and they buy. So if you look at the picture on this drum, it just came from some chemical factory. Oil is put in there and it's sold to consumers. And just look at the hygiene. So there's real significant issues. So yes, it's affordability, but what are costs in terms of health? Here is another example. Yes, you saw very fantastic examples of sachets, but traders in the market are buying a drum of oil and repackaging in these plastic tubes and selling. There's food safety issues, there's quality issues, but there's also traceability issues. There's a drum from this supplier, another drum from that supplier, and if there's something wrong, how do you trace it back to the original supplier? And they're mixing the various types of oil. And there's food safety issues in terms of handling and hygiene. Never mind that even in those models where these large businesses are packaging in sachets and these small traders are also packaging in these small tubes, this is all plastic. And so what does this mean for the environment in terms of the amount and the mountain of plastic that we're putting out there? With those issues, what is it that we can do? What should we be thinking about to resolve some of those issues? Should we just be thinking about nutritious foods, or should we be thinking, more broadly behind just talking about nutrition? I mean, this is literally drawing inspiration from, what's happening in Kenya and other places around ATMs for milk. Should some of these technologies be adopted more broadly, and in this case, because I'm talking about fortified foods, within the fortified food sector, what is it going to take? Does the cost actually justify it? Or are there ways to minimize the cost or to optimize? So there's issues to think around innovations and shaping markets for fortified foods. But again, affordability is great in terms of selling this stuff in sachets or pouches. And yes, we're getting the nutrients out there, but there is this planetary health that we need to think about. So I know one of the biggest challenges is everybody talks about biodegradable packaging, but no one actually does anything about it, and maybe the cost of it is so significant. And what's the incentive for these businesses to invest this huge amount of money into this with payback periods that probably are way too long? What can governments and NGOs and foundations, how can innovation be activated, and who de-risks that sort of investment into this area? And should we actually be thinking about doing this as a nutrition community, or is it somebody else's job to do that? with that, we, a small group of us within GAIN, but we're trying to get a lot of folks involved, is how do we start thinking about some of these issues? Yes, initially we're trying to focus on fortification and biofortification, but more broadly is how do we begin thinking about shaping markets and bring in some innovations that are going to be solving some of these issues. And it's not really about us, it's about how do we build a community that puts out various challenges around innovations, around business models, and other issues that we're facing within the sector, and come up with solutions. And that's building a big collaboration. I mean, we're calling the initiative Micronutrient Innovation Facility. I've got to warn you in advance, it doesn't actually exist as a facility. It's a concept development that we're working on at this stage, but if people are interested to discuss this in more details, feel free to contact me and one of my colleagues who is sitting in the audience, Soria, who's leading that work. So with that, I come to the end. I'm not offering solutions, I'm just asking questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving us a very concrete example of some of the kind of issues that we explored in the first presentation. I think that really made us able to visualize both some of the ways that those strategies can be operationalized, but also some of the potential challenges. And thank you also for ending early. You're the first speaker in this whole conference to end early. I hope we are now joined from Paris by Lucy. I see we are. Welcome, Paris.
Thank you very much. I'm actually not in Paris. We're at our team retreat at Hystra in the south of France. So I apologize.
Even better, south of France.
I apologize for not being there in person, which I would have loved to do. Thanks a lot for the previous to the previous panel participants who raised some topics that I'll talk about as well. And thanks, Saul, for inviting me to participate. What I'd like to present today is a piece of research we conducted at Hystra a couple of years ago as part of the work we did for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which had set up a group of consultancies as experts to support the private sector in providing better nutrition. We were the business model innovation hub of that group of organizations. And so we really tried to understand what were the kind of business model innovations that could drive more uptake, more creation and uptake of nutritious foods, in particular for lower income populations. And so this piece of research specifically tried to understand how these kind of products could really reach people, not at the last mile, because the last mile is sometimes too much when it's products you have to buy every day, but really at the last 100 meters where they shop every day. So the reason also for looking at it this way is because one of the key challenges in the sector of nutrition is not just to get the product out there, but also to get it consumed frequently enough. And I'm going to bring a name that is not necessarily one you heard so much at the nutrition conference, which is Coca-Cola, but just to give you a fun fact that very few people know, that actually the median buyer of Coca-Cola in the world doesn't consume 300 a year, but actually only 1 to 2 cans per year. The average, because this is the median, the average is 12 cans per year, 12, so 1 a month, basically. So even these iconic products we have in mind as super consumed are actually not consumed that much. And if you think of it from a business perspective, like you want to achieve a certain target of sales, which is where the two graphs here show, there are two ways to get to a certain level of sales. Either you try to get to maximize penetration, and then you potentially try to increase consumption frequency, or you try to get fewer consumers, but who are loyal consumers, and you really focus on first getting consumers who consume every day. And in theory, in the nutrition space, if we are concerned about health impact, this should be what we look for. Models that can really allow this high consumption frequency, because especially if we're charging a premium for nutritious foods because they're fortified and they're more expensive, we have to make sure that if a consumer buys it, he doesn't actually loses money doing this for nothing because he's only consuming once a month and it actually doesn't help him or her get a better life. So the mandate here, the reason to look for these channels that really reach the last 100 meters was wondering how can we get to this frequent consumption. To do that, we looked at 11 organizations, 5 projects that were actually supported through that Bill and Melinda Gates initiative, and 6 other organizations that were selling nutritious products. And we added a bit of flavor from the other sectors we've looked at in last mile distribution. I should mention we're also a co-founder of the Global Distributors Collective with BOP Inc., so that's an area where we've also studied quite a few models. And so we looked across these models to try to understand what was really the impact of direct sales forces in particular. On the one hand, in terms of increasing effectiveness of the models in the sense of increasing consumption frequency of the nutritious food products we were looking at. And on the other hand, in increasing the efficiency, so the cost aspect, because obviously for this to be sustainable, it has to be somewhat commercially viable for the companies that are setting up these systems as well. I'll talk about these different examples as we go through the presentation. So the first thing we did is try to map a bit the overall landscape of distribution channels that lower income consumers shop in. At the top here, you have the fixed ones, at the bottom, the mobile ones, and the arrow here represents how close to home they are, so how much part of the last 100 meters they are really for people. So from models that really do door-to-door in homes to street vendors who are in semi-fixed locations, typically close to where a lot of people live, informal retailers and small cafeterias that are fixed, then to sandwich and snack kiosks, which will typically be closer to where people work, because that's typically where they'll eat for lunch, or kiosk in the markets, and at the bottom in the mobile equivalent of that, which is street vendors looking for impulse purchase, so typically more at places where a lot of people pass during the day, but don't necessarily live. And the focus of what we'll discuss are really the ones that are closer to home, again, with that focus on where can people repeat purchase these kind of nutritious products. So what we found is that there are basically 2 types of impact or 2 key moments when direct sales force can play a role over time as product sales pick up. So the first one is at market activation, at launch, where they can play a really strong market activation role. And then at steady state, they can play a role in long-term home delivery or direct delivery to help also encourage consumption frequency. I'll go through each of the individual benefits in the next couple of slides. So if we look first at market activation, the first useful thing that the direct sales force can do is to fill in logistics value chain gaps. What that means is typically if your product requires either a cold chain or a hot chain, if it's a product that needs to be consumed warm, you need a special infrastructure to deliver that product correctly. So Grameen Danone Foods, which I imagine a lot of you are familiar with, it's the joint venture, between Grameen and Danone that is in Bangladesh selling nutritious yogurts. And when they started in 2006, there was no cold chain in rural areas or around the factory. Even in urban areas, we didn't necessarily have fridges in shops. So they set up direct sales force that could basically transport their product correctly and even just to the point where they were selling them. So directly selling these products to lower income consumers. Over time, like in 2012, so 6 years later, they actually reassessed that and changed the role of that sales force, because in the meantime, a lot of fridges had become available in shops, notably because some big soft drink company that I'm not going to mention again had set up fridges, and so they were able to piggyback on that existing infrastructure. But at launch, one of their key roles for their direct sales force was really filling in these logistic gaps. A second role that direct sales forces can play at launch is replacing some of the marketing spends. For example, Africa Improved Foods, which is a very large producer of nutritious flours or fortified flour based in Rwanda, when they launched one of their new products in Kenya, they conducted home, basically door-to-door sales, where they also were able to demonstrate how to cook the products. They managed to convert 60% of the people they went to whose home they went during that event, and it proved for them much more effective than spending on big media, etc. So it can actually replace some of the marketing spend, especially if it's about a new brand that nobody knows yet or that few people know. When a brand is very well known and it's just launching one new SKU in their portfolio, it can make sense to have a big campaign. People will recognize what it is, but for new brands in particular, it can be really more cost effective to use a direct sales force for this initial activation. The third benefit at launch is to gather rapid and direct feedback from consumers. Pain d'agneau was a sweet potato bread that we helped launch through a project co-funded by the French Development Agency and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in the Sahel region, where we worked with a local company to create this naturally fortified sweet potato bread. During the pilot phase, the fact that we had a door-to-door sales force enabled us to get some key customer insights. And for example, realizing that the initial feedback we had from the bread was that it wasn't sweet enough, but actually that feedback came from children and fathers or male customers, while actually the goal of the bread was really to help, in particular, women deficiencies in terms of vitamin A and other vitamins that were added to the bread. So that feedback enabled us to know, actually, given our target, it's fine, and we don't need to work on the recipe anymore. And it's an insight which would have been much harder to get otherwise. The fourth reason why a direct sales force might be useful at launch is to encourage consumption frequency, because it can help create an early routine if the sales force is going door to door or at least does the exact same routes every day. This is what Nutritious, that my colleague from GAME mentioned also at the beginning, has done in Madagascar. They sell infant porridge either in its dry form at shops or via baby restaurants, as they call them, or via a direct sales force that goes door to door selling ready-to-eat porridge at breakfast time. And having that direct sales force enabled them to get close to 50% penetration in the household that have children, in the areas that their sales ladies basically walk through. And it's also enabled them to get to 35% of all of their clients who buy the product every day for their children. A 35% compliance rate, if I can call it that, is extremely high in this sector. And obviously, they keep doing it now, even though it's not like it's a more expensive channel for them than the retail, because of that impact that it enables them to have. So continuing with the long-term advantage it can have, so Nutritious again continues to do this, and people continue to buy it from there instead of the shops because of the convenience. Over the long term, there is still that aspect that the sales force, direct sales force can have, which is I don't need to go to the shop myself. I can actually buy directly from the sales lady who comes at the time of breakfast, and I don't need to cook a special meal for my child. Today, these sales represent 30% of Nutritious sales. The retail is actually 50%. Interesting fact as well, retail at the beginning didn't want to take on their product because it was new and they wouldn't know if it would sell. Having that direct sales force, having initial adoption, then led retail to become the main channel once they felt confident that they would sell the product because they had seen the sales ladies go around and children running to them to get the product. So also a way to market the product, not just to consumers, but also to retailers. The second advantage over the long term that this can have is to really unlock a new or specific consumer segment. Bell Sharing Cities is the program by Bell, which is a French dairy company, in several cities where they really tried to work with local existing existing street vendors to add their product, the laughing cow in particular, to the basket of these street vendors. It's been a great success for them really to tap into the kind of lower middle income segments because before their products were only available in modern trade and some of the higher end retailers. And through this, they've been able to penetrate in segments that would never have bought their product otherwise. I should say these products are also fortified. And today in Antananarivo, or in Madagascar, that direct channel represents 20% of their sales. In Vietnam, in Ho Chi Minh, it represents 10% of their sales. So it's not insignificant and helps drive growth for them beyond what they could have done otherwise. Finally, going back to that point of consumption frequency, having that channel together with others is also a way to multiply occasions to purchase. Fan Prime is one of the products that we helped develop through the BMGF project I was mentioning earlier in Nigeria with Danone, who already had a very strong brand called Fan Milk of frozen yogurts. Fan Prime was the fortified version of that with a specific premix tailored to pregnant or to women of reproductive age specifically. And we sold that new SKU both through retail shops, through their direct mail sales force that they already had. And we set up a special women sales force to really try to reach these women, to try to encourage consumption frequency in that segment. The results come just here. So on this graph, you can see on each chart the percentage of women of reproductive age clients purchasing Fan Prime through each of the channels that they were sold through. The random sample one was for a population who was not necessarily buying the product. And Fan Prime vendor customers were the specific women sales force. Fan Milk vendor customers are the male sales force who also sold the other SKU. And then the shop customers who purchased Fan Prime were the people who purchased from shops where other products were also available. The first interesting thing to see, so the dark blue here is the percentage of frequent customers who purchased at least several times per week. You can see that the women channel, so basically the Fan Prime vendor customers, were twice as many. So there were twice as many frequent customers in the direct sales force from women, so the ones who are specialized in that, as opposed to the Fan Milk vendor customers. So in terms of selling regularly at specific points where women were more present in the markets where these ladies were selling, we really achieved a higher consumption frequency than if we had just had mail. That was kind of what we assumed from the start. The thing that surprised us, and I think the key learning from that, was actually where there were most frequent customers at the end of the day, 2 months after launch, was at the shops. Because this is actually where women, at the end of the day, they had heard of the product from where they went shopping at the market. But the place where they came back to buy every day was the shop next to their place, which makes sense if you think of it. That's really where they need to have the product to buy it frequently. So like the direct sales force aspect in terms of actual effect on sales and frequency of purchase is one to really kickstart the sales, create that habits, but then it has to be part of a broader mix in order to really maximize that consumption frequency. So this is in terms of the effectiveness part, like how much sales, how much frequency do we manage to get with this kind of models. But now the question is, what does it mean in terms of cost? Because people and companies will typically say, one, I don't know how to do this, and two, it will be too expensive. So we've tried to look at different models that had both a retail channel and a direct sales force. DSF here stands for direct sales force. The bar charts you see here are the percentage of the end price for customers that was spent on the distribution. And as you can see, for all of these models, save the third company, which had the same cost for both, a direct sales force was indeed more expensive. So it is true that in most cases, a direct sales force will end up being more expensive than going through traditional retail. One key reason for this is that in order to keep your direct sales force motivated, you need to give them a quite strong margin on your products, especially if they're selling only your product, because there's only so much they can carry, there's only so much they can sell in one day. So if they don't get a high enough margin on that, they're not going to earn enough money and they're not going to stay. Which is why that light gray color or light purple color here, which is the margin going to these agents, is actually higher than the margin going to retail, but the retailers are selling more products so they can afford to not have such high margins. So it's more expensive. So what should you do then? More effective, but more expensive. The thing is, it actually also replaces other costs that we don't think about necessarily. As we said at the beginning, it can actually replace some of the marketing costs. And it can also have that marketing effect for a longer time. Here, we've compared for 2 countries where we've worked on these topics, Pakistan and Nigeria, the cost of having a direct sales force for 1 year and the cost of what the alternative typically was for the companies we were working with. And in Pakistan, 50 direct sales agents cost you the same as just 2 weeks on advertising on TV, radio, basically of 360 advertising, so quite big advertising, but it's still 50 agents for a full year versus 2 weeks of advertising. In Nigeria, the ratio is a bit more in favor of the radio and out of home, although this one didn't include TV, because TV would have pushed that ratio, made that ratio look really, or rather the number of weeks would have been very small, because TV is very expensive in Nigeria. But anyway, 43 direct sales force agents corresponded to 11 weeks of media, not including TV. So for companies, there's that balance to be found. And overall, given the additional effectiveness and how much faster you can get penetration with the direct sales force, and in particular with your target groups with the right consumption frequency, we do think that this should be part of the mix of a distribution strategy for companies really willing to have an impact via nutritious foods. And how to convince the boardroom to do this is what we've tried to represent on this graph, by basically looking not just at the additional costs. So in red here, all right, I'll start with the graph. What we've tried to represent here is the profit and loss statement for nutritious foods. The revenues are in blue, so that's how much you would earn from your typical products. In red, you have the costs, so the COGS, which are the cost of goods sold of the product, and then what is typically called SG&A, selling, general and administrative expenses, so all the cost of the people in the company, everything that is not the product cost. And then in gray, we've put the additional sales or additional costs that direct sales force bring. Typically, the first thing to note on the revenue column at the left is that an additional sales force doesn't just bring you additional sales by itself. It also creates a halo effect where you get additional sales in other channels. This is what Nutritious saw, that in the areas where they have their sales ladies going, they actually sell more in shops. And this has also been seen by some of the other companies that had both retail and a direct sales force. So you get a bit of additional sales, which come with a bit of additional COGS. So at the end of the day, you have a higher gross margin from the additional volumes you've made, but then you have to bear the additional costs of managing that sales force, which is the piece on the SG&A that is in, how do you call that in striped red and gray colors here. And these costs are significant. But on the other hand, you get all these additional benefits of having a direct sales force, which we've put in gray on the right side. Marketing benefits, you save on above the line and below the line marketing. Purpose, you save potentially on human, on HR spending, because you get a better image for new candidates who are interested in joining the company, and on public affairs spending. And the additional value generated. This is actually why some of the Danone projects we looked at, the Quiteiras one in Brazil, notably, that I didn't mention, which also has a direct sales force to go into lower income areas. That's how they managed to get it through the boardroom, saying, okay, it's true, it's going to be a bit more expensive. We're going to make a bit less margin on this product than on
you have 2 more minutes.
Yes, I will finish in 2 minutes. Thank you. But at the same time, we also are creating such goodwill for our company by doing this that it's worth it. And finally, you can get externalities. So you can get co-funding by donors or by organizations interested in pushing that health impact that can potentially also compensate that cost. So at the end of the day, if you take into account these externalities, you can actually get to a good rationale for a company to take on these additional costs, launch nutritious foods via direct sales force, achieve health impact, and yet make a healthy profit. So last word, choosing the right distribution strategy is just 10% of the success. The other 90% depends on perfect execution. So what I just talked about, which is more or less the strategy, is on its 10% of the solution. Then there's the question of how you manage that sales force to make it successful. There are a few best practice strategies on that I won't get into here, but that are in our report that this presentation is coming from, which you can find on our website. It's the one at the bottom right on this slide. And we have a few other documents coming from that same program with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation around how to make a direct sales force effective, around what marketing tactics can create frequency of consumption, and around when a woman sales force specifically makes sense, not just for nutrition, but more broadly for health-related products. And I will end here. Thank you, Sol, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Lucy, so much for that. Thank you for emphasizing the importance of the frequency of consumption for these nutritious foods and for introducing us to the benefits and potential costs of direct sales forces as one component in the strategy, in the business model for these. Thank you also for introducing the gender aspects of this work and for giving us a very detailed quantitative assessment of how such a business model could work. We're now ready to transition to the questions and answer part of this. If you have, those of you in the hall, if you have questions for our panelists, please do line up behind the microphone that's put in the middle of the central corridor there. That way, everybody will be able to hear you. I think I have great difficulty seeing, but I see there's somebody there. The light is very bright. Let's take the first question from the hall, and then I have a couple online as well.
Thanks, Sol. Thanks to the wonderful panel for this very intriguing presentations. My name is Katrin Demmler. I work with the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. I just, and I'm a great fan of the of reaching the bottom of the pyramid, and I think we can learn a lot. I'm just curious about, Panjani started talking about challenges, and clearly there are some challenges in terms of sustainability. I would be interested in hearing whether there are any other ethical considerations we should ask ourselves when we apply these methods to reaching the poorest of the poor. Thanks.
Who would like to kick us off on that one? Looks like Panjani will.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, if not quite a big question, Catherine. Are there ethical considerations? I think the answer is yes. There were those drums that I put there. It wasn't for the shock factor. This is something that's really in the market. The question that we have to think about is, would most of us that are sitting in this room comfortably go to a market and buy that edible oil and take it home and consume? I think the answer is no for most of us. But we all work on these programs. I work in fortification. I've worked in fortification for a few years, which is understatement. But it's out there, and most of us do, and we see these things every day. The question is, do we just say, focus ourselves on saying the oil is fortified, it's out there, people are consuming, or we actually look at some of these injustices? But by me saying that, it doesn't mean there's an easy solution, because like I said, this oil is 20, 30% cheaper. Otherwise, these folks can't actually afford the packaged oil. So in as much as I'm saying there's ethical considerations and difficult issues, they're not easy solutions. But I think one way of beginning to think about solutions is sort of acknowledge that there's an ethical issue here, and what do we do about it, no matter how hard it is. At least that's a first step to solving it. So, like I said, I'm not giving solutions. I'm also asking you the question, and everybody else. I'm hoping to learn from everybody in this room. Thanks.
And if I could just add to that answer, I think, great question, Catherine. The first thing to realize about these approaches, I think, is that they are not the solution, right? They are one of many different options that need to be pursued, and particularly when we're really thinking about the poorest of the poor, we need to be quite realistic about what is the purchasing power that's actually available to them and how much can market-based solutions be the answer. And think instead also about social protection programs, livelihoods, what can we do to bring up their income level to make it so that they have better access to nutritious foods, because certainly this alone won't do it. But that said, I do think there are a couple areas of particular concern from an ethical standpoint. One is all of these different approaches we've been talking about, as Panjani highlighted really well with those great images, they can be done well and they can be done poorly, right? And when they're done poorly, they are exposing a very vulnerable population to food safety issues, or perhaps also to products that aren't that nutritious. So this needs to be done with a lot of quality and with ensuring that the food safety is in place, and also that the products that are actually promoted are nutritious. And I think that brings me to kind of the second ethical concern. As all of us within the nutrition field know, when you're dealing with private sector companies, there are a lot of promising opportunities there, but there are also risks, right? So once a private sector company begins to engage with low-income consumers, finds ways to reach them, discovers that they are a market that can be reached, that does have purchasing power, is it certain that they're going to stick with nutritious foods, right? We see, Coca-Cola products reaching the BOP all over the world. So certainly these types of channels can also be used for non-nutritious foods, and that could work to the detriment of diet quality among low-income consumers. So they need to be looked at very carefully. But at the same time, I think it's important to consider what is the alternative, right? Are we, because this might be tricky, this might be difficult, this might have some negative outcomes, are we just not going to engage and not consider lower-income consumers? I don't think many of us would want that outcome, so I think we need to think about these options, but not see it as a reason why we wouldn't want to engage in this space.
I'm going to take one online question, and then I see there's somebody wanting to jump in. We'll come back to the hall. So the online question is, from your experiences, what is the motivation for multinationals and SMEs, small and medium enterprises, to continue trying to reach the base of the pyramid consumers with nutritious foods when we see that the margins are so low and costs are high, such as those of managing the sales force? Maybe Nick, you could take that one, and then maybe Lucy also.
Yeah, sure. So I think indeed, as was written by Prahalat, the fortune of the base of the pyramid, I think businesses are gradually seeing that it is indeed an interesting business opportunity that also, of course, allows opportunity for inclusion. But indeed that for many emerging markets, it's where the majority of the market is, and the accumulative value of that market is higher than the middle income customer or the top of the pyramid, economic pyramid, let's so to say. So I think that business opportunity is there. And I think that's part of the reason for companies to have an interest in that segment.
Lucy, would you like to add to that? Not sure we still have her. Yes, there you are.
Oh, okay. Could you hear me, or should I?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. No, I was saying, I think the motivation between an SME and a multinational will be quite different. And then within a multinational, depending on which department you talk to, for example, the HR at Danone were very happy that Danone was doing all these things in terms of nutritious products, running Danone Ventures, etc., because of the good reputation they earn and that enabled them to really get talent. And like the communication department typically also really likes a nice story with beautiful photos of a sales lady providing good products from a very, I don't know if it's cynical, but just, that's one of the things that can motivate them to get into these approaches. What we've seen in the programs we've done with local companies, especially in markets where such beneficial products are lacking and nutritious, starts to be more awareness on the nutritious issues that people are facing. For example, in West Africa, local companies can have a deep, and in particular the CEOs or founders of these companies can have a deep personal motivation, social motivation in actually doing something better for their country. And then, especially in these markets when the specialized food is not so developed, and there's kind of an opportunity to tackle these segments of vulnerable population who actually would want to consume better products with products that are affordable. We have seen that, the motivation can be much more social, and that there is actually a big commercial opportunity. For example, in the Sahel region with the Mariam project I mentioned, where we supported local companies in producing more nutritious fortified foods and launched 7 products. One of them was fortified spices to add to the meal, and specifically targeting women. we realized that in Niger, this was the first product targeting women ever launched on the market. There was no product specifically for women targeting their deficiency or just even marketing itself as a product, food product that was specifically good for women. So in that sense, some of these markets are still at a stage where actually there would be really a market opportunity in developing products that are more tailored, not with a huge premium, but with a small premium corresponding to the kind of targetization or specialization in the market. And so both that commercial objective and the social objective that some founders see in serving these markets can be very strong drivers.
Thank you very much. Going back to the hall now.
Thank you. My name is Fadwa Shauki. I'm working at the European Commission, INTPA, for International Partnerships in Nutrition. My question goes to Lucy, but also to the colleagues from GAIN. And I'm going to talk from a donor's perspective. So I thought the study was very interesting for the marketing and sales forces, etc. When we are supporting local production of nutritious food, of course we want those nutritious food to be accessible and affordable for the most vulnerable ones. And you were saying that one of the things that you were recommending is to put efforts on communication and advertisement, etc. The issue is that as donors, it's difficult for us to favor one or another company because they are private sectors. So the way to do it would be rather to, let's say, advertise for more nutritious food in general and not specifically for one brand or one company. So I was wondering, did you take this into account in your study and how? And what recommendation would you give us as donors where to put the money so that we would be more efficient in making nutritious food really accessible and to sensitize better, to improve the sensitization of the consumers so that they go for more nutritious food. Thank you.
I think I'll pass that one to Lucy again, as I know you've worked on the Obasama program in Ghana, which did attempt to market essentially a brand or an umbrella brand of nutritious foods. So perhaps you could tell us about that.
Sure. Actually, I think Panjani knows this one maybe potentially better than I do. But and we didn't work on it specifically, but we did study it. The approaches we've seen that really try to promote either do sensitization around the topics of more nutritious foods and how important it is to have a good diet without promoting a certain brand or product typically have no effect on the sales of nutritious products. And we've seen that across markets, across types of campaigns. Generic, so it depends what you want to do. If you want to increase the level of awareness as a donor on nutritious food, yes, that's probably a good thing to do. If you actually want to see an impact in changing behaviors of what people buy, I haven't seen one program, and I've looked at a few that have managed through generic communications to increase the sales of specific products. The one example that I've seen that worked in doing that has been salt in I'm going to get the country wrong, in one of the countries of Southeast Asia, I think it was in Nepal, where, and there have been research papers written on this that are really enlightening, but there they realized that they had an issue with salt iodization, which was compulsory, but actually some salt, which was a rougher salt, was still not being fortified properly. And so the campaign that they launched was about switching from unrefined salt to refined salt, where consumers could clearly see the difference between the two. So in that case, they didn't advertise for a specific brand, but they made it clear that if you wanted the fortification, you had to go with refined salt. And that's what people did, and that really had an impact on changing behavior. But if you're just doing a campaign on, for example, the importance of iron, and you hope that people will know to make the link between that and products that claim separately that they're fortified with iron, what we've seen is that that doesn't work. And it's been also confirmed by multinationals that have tried themselves to do these diagnostic campaigns together with the government. Well, they had some products with iron or with other fortificants, and like it doesn't actually impact sales. So again, it depends what you want to do. If you want to raise awareness on nutrition, it can work. If what you want is to change behavior on buying more nutritious foods, from what we've seen, if you don't brand it,
Thank you. Panjani, is the experience with fortified brands similar?
I think broadly speaking, yes. And I guess one of the biggest problems that is faced in trying to promote fortified foods is what message you communicate and whether you're actually going to get through to consumers if you're talking about functional benefits, and whether consumers have this capacity to deconstruct all these messages, particularly if there's heavy talking about anemia and all this other stuff. So that's the biggest issue when it comes to communicating fortified foods. And I guess what you see is more companies almost using fortified foods as a mark of quality because consumers can sort of, in some ways, relate to that and pretty much maybe moving away from the nutritional messaging content. Thanks.
Thank you. Going back to the online questions, Stella, we have one for you from Tanemun Mahamadou, and she really liked your presentation, and she's asking, what are the plans for the next steps of research on this agenda, and are you planning to do something in West Africa?
So yes, great question. Of course, when you do a systematic review and you come up with research gaps, there's an obvious next question of, okay, are you going to go fill those research gaps? So we're going to try to focus on certain companies and products that were identified in the review and do follow-up surveys with actual consumers of those products to try and verify, are they really low-income consumers? How do they compare to kind of a population that doesn't consume those products? And are they actually buying those products for the reasons that companies think they are, right? So if a company has adapted its business model in a way that it thinks is helping it to reach lower income consumers, do the consumers agree? Is that the reason that they selected that product? And what are the other things that are kind of entering into their decision around choosing that particular product? And hopefully also get some interviews or data from companies to try and verify the profitability angle, because that was one of the major gaps that came out of the review, is whether or not these companies are profitable. That's a challenging question to answer, and it's really difficult to get that kind of data, but we'll see what we can do. And we may be including countries in West Africa within that research, particularly looking at Nigeria and Benin, which both have several interesting business models that turned up as part of the review.
Thank you. And back to the hall.
Hi, thank you for this excellent panel. My name is Claire Null. I'm from Mathematica. We worked with, hi Lucy, with Hystra on some of these projects, and I just wanted to come back to the earlier point about thorny ethical issues. In one of these projects, when a fortified product was introduced at a subsidized price, we had some very difficult conversations later about whether we were glad that women were buying the fortified product or concerned that they were probably spending money on that they would have otherwise spent on other things. So it can get into really gray area, I think, when you start looking at dietary diversity. On the other hand, if you get realistic and say, like, well, maybe they weren't going to buy fruits and vegetables anyway, and so we're just glad that they're at least getting the fortified product, I think it requires quite a bit of self-reflection, and especially when there are donors involved, that changes the dynamics. As opposed to a company, which has kind of a more clear, often, motivation of profitability. I was also going to build on Lucy's presentation with a point about trying to maximize the nutrition benefits. The project in Nigeria, the frozen yogurt, the shops, we found there were some very clear and pretty simple things they could do to reduce the chance that women were substituting from buying fruits to making it more likely that they would have otherwise gotten a Coke instead of the frozen yogurt product. So just by choosing the shops where they were stocking and making sure they weren't offering, this is an additional business opportunity to a vendor of fruit, but instead offering it to someone who was selling biscuits and sodas, made it much more likely that the substitution was a healthy one. So, thanks.
Thank you for those very interesting comments. I think they were comments more than questions directly. Anybody else in the room have a question they would like to ask?
Thank you so much. My name is Mercy Mwinde from Kenya, running a private company, a small company in providing nutritious foods called Sweet and Dried. And thank you, BioPink, because you supported us on this. And now we are at that point where we are providing of nutritious porridge to over 300 micro-enterprises. But my question is, what we have found is the cost of distribution compared to the bigger companies who already have an established system of distribution, because you find the cost of fuel, for example, in Kenya, has gone way over. And the challenge is the micro-enterprises are so much deep into the villages. They need the product, yes. When we did the activation, they loved the product, but reaching to them becomes a challenge. Probably why I'm here is to try and look for what solutions can be offered so that the micro-enterprises, especially the village women who run the small outlets, to have access to the charm booster porridge that we sell, and maybe also ways of collaborating to reduce the cost of production, because the cost of producing the nutritious porridge for us is quite high because of the logistics of sourcing of the dried fruits. We use dried fruits, dried vegetables, and tubers to make the porridge. So probably maybe you can advise us what should be the next step from here. Thank you.
Well, Mercy, thanks for being here, and all the credits to you for developing those products and getting them to market as a private business. Of course, I'm a big fan of Mercy's business, having worked with her for a while. I don't know what the next steps are. I mean, you have a lot of smart people here in the room. For instance, Lucy and myself, we can make great presentations on how to optimize your distribution and profit margin and all of that stuff, but I know that it's a very hard game, and yeah, I hope that actually one of the steps you can take is to present here, perhaps on Friday with a larger audience even, and perhaps get some people interested to see where they can be of benefit beyond the people you already have in your network. And at least for me, it's a good reminder again to search even harder for potential investors and donors and partners to support your business even further. So that's it from my end, Mercy.
Great, thank you very much. I'll just quickly summarize what we heard from our excellent set of speakers. We heard that there's a lot of challenges in this area, both surrounding the type of products specific to nutritious food products, but also to this particular consumer segment. We also heard that there's limited formal evidence in this area about business models that can work, but on the other hand, there's a lot of experiential learning, both from our speakers and also from those of you who offered your thoughts and comments from the audience. I think we definitely saw that it is possible to do business with this level, with this target group. We've seen examples of product sales that have really gone to scale, including the amazing example of iodized salt, which reaches up to 90% of the population, and that you can some of the strategies that have been offered really offer amazing savings for the businesses. All of this was summed up in the need to clearly articulate the business model that can reach base of the pyramid consumers. And we heard about some key aspects of these business models. Tweaking with the product itself to get that right for this consumer segment. We heard about work around packaging, and then finally we heard a lot, in fact, about distribution and retail and how that can be exploited to really reach down to this group. I think there are some key principles that can be drawn out of this in getting this work right. First of all, the need to truly understand the consumers that we're trying to serve and also the business environment that we're trying to work in. Not just a superficial understanding, but a deep understanding based on human-centric design. Secondly, the need to go truly local. Lucy talked about a radius of 100 meters. You can't get much more local than that. And that is a key element in trying to make all of this work. And finally, that minor instruction that we should aim for perfect execution. We will all try and do that. Sometimes perfection is hard to reach, but we'll try. Big thanks to our speakers, and thank you all for joining us.